There are countless debates, countless topics of discussion dissecting and comparing both Marvel and DC movies. Now, critically, I think it's pretty safe to say that Marvel just makes better movies overall. That point is almost undisputed. However, after the more recent DC movies like Shazam, Birds of Prey, and Wonder Woman 1984, I think it's fair to say that the DCEU is starting to develop a style that is perhaps very interesting and unique in comparison to the MCU. Hey guys, my name is DJ, and when comparing the two different cinematic universes of Marvel and DC, I think it's fair to say that these differences are absolutely astonishing. If you were to look at these movies with a more critical eye, as I so often do on this channel, then it's fair to say that the differences between these two franchises have created one very successful universe, and one that really just is not as interesting or successful. But today, thankfully, my job is not to look at or review these movies. If it were, then I'd probably end up crying and in the fetal position by the end of Justice League. No, instead, I want to turn your attention to an observation that I have recently made when comparing the two universes. When looking at the separate evolutions of Marvel and DC, from their early beginnings to their more recent outings, it's safe to say that the DCEU has gone through some more brutal growing pains. And that's mainly due to the tonal differences between the early DC movies and the more modern ones. Man of Steel and Batman v Superman were two movies that had a very dark tone. Superman was portrayed as a god among man, and Batman was out here killing people like he had an unfulfilled bloodlust. But, like I said, the DCEU has definitely evolved, and I think many people would agree with me that it's evolved for the better. Instead of these movies feeling all doom and gloom, the more modern DC movies have adopted an approach that not even the MCU has really tried to go towards. Movies like Shazam, Birds of Prey, and Wonder Woman 1984 have decided to adopt the more wacky and outlandish stylings of a regular comic book. It has traded out the dark blues, blacks, and grays for the more saturated and cartoony colors of pink, green, and red. And this shift in both color and tone has been a very welcome change for many fans, including myself. Because at the end of the day, I don't think many people really want to watch a super dark and gritty movie all the time. Sometimes people just want the wacky and zany world of comic books to appear on screen. And before you yell at me, yes, the Guardians of the Galaxy movies do take a very similar approach to this wacky style of a superhero movie. The Guardians of the Galaxy movies are so much more colorful, so much more vibrant, and so much more cartoony than anything else in the MCU. However, I would argue that these movies in the MCU feel more like the exception to the rule, whereas more recently, the DC movies have taken this tonal shift as the rule. For the most part, the MCU and the DCEU are on totally different sides of the spectrum when it comes to overall realism. Sure, the MCU may have wizards and aliens and insect people like Mantis and Spider-Man, but it all sort of feels grounded in reality. A lot of it, for the most part, still has a realistic element to it, whether it be in Iron Man's technology or in some sort of experiment gone wrong. I talked briefly about this in my Captain America Civil War video, but I would argue that none of these heroes have any real powers. Most of them get their abilities from their technology, or from their education, or from their own chemical enhancements. Outside of Thor, Captain Marvel, Spider-Man, and maybe Star-Lord, I wouldn't really call any of these heroes superheroes. The MCU, for the most part, plays with ordinary people. People who were at one point just like you and me. Boring human beings who have lived boring human lives before transforming into these costume vigilantes ready to fight back against the threat of danger, which is fine. Typically that makes for an interesting and compelling superhero. Hell, that's probably why people gravitate towards Marvel as opposed to DC, but we'll get back to that conversation in a moment. Because when comparing the MCU superheroes to the small handful of DC heroes we have on screen, then you can really see how not so super these MCU heroes are. And this has always sort of been the difference between Marvel and DC. Marvel has always created characters who are more grounded, and DC have always created gods among men. While Peter Parker must deal with the realistic side effects of being some kid who is Spider-Man on the side, Green Lantern is never really shown to have those struggles, as they seem to focus more on the heroic aspect of his life. And these differences can be reflected in their movies, as I mentioned earlier. You have regular human beings doing karate in the MCU, and literal gods flying across the planet in DC. Hell, let's just take this opportunity to compare two fight scenes from both Marvel and DC. Let's compare the highway fight scene in Captain America: The Winter Soldier, and let's compare the warehouse fight scene in Birds of Prey. Two fight scenes revolving around generally normal human beings. With Winter Soldier, you see how there's no real impact in any punch. It's kind of just them trading generic offense back and forth with no real physical impact. Sure, Steve may have some dirt or a cut on his face, but overall, it's just kind of two regular guys doing, well, regular karate. Whereas with the Birds of Prey scene, everything in the fight feels brutal. Sure, the R rating probably helps with this brutality, but the impact of each blow and the inhuman power of each baseball swing makes this scene feel almost superhuman. With general Marvel fight scenes, everything sort of feels grounded and tame. Hell, Thanos even makes reference to this in Infinity War when he says,
"All that for a drop of blood."
But with the DC movies, every single punch and kick feels like an overwhelmingly powerful force. So when looking at them side by side, you can very easily see the power differences between the two universes. However, I would argue that that makes DC movies really hard to take seriously sometimes. Whereas Marvel, as shown in Endgame, are susceptible to a realistic death of a beloved character, it's really hard to believe that DC would actually kill off one of their heroes, or at the very least, keep their heroes dead. And without their stakes, and of course with their overall intensity and brutality in their fight scenes, it's really hard to even fathom the idea of Superman, Wonder Woman, or the Flash dying on screen. But that doesn't really mean that it's a bad thing. I mean, no one really believed that Thor or the Hulk were gonna die in the first Avengers movie, but that lessening of the stakes doesn't subtract from the enjoyment of that movie. The joy, at least for me, was found in their character progression and interesting dynamics. But with these DC movies, I would argue that the joy actually comes from this hyper unrealistic aspect of their universe. Like, Shazam is so unrealistic that Marvel characters would absolutely laugh at this kid. But that's one of the main draws for me when it comes to these films. It's the incredibly unrealistic and absolutely cartoony nature of these heroes. And if we were to keep talking about Shazam for a moment, I think that that movie in particular is a perfect example of what the DCEU should try to be. It's sort of a great combination of what I love about Marvel and DC movies. It's the Marvel character dynamics and world building mixed in with the DC cartoonish visuals and ideas. Sure, I'm not saying that all DC movies necessarily need to be a comedy, but I mean, it's hard enough to take them seriously in the first place. Which is why it seems like the writers of these movies have decided to lean into that. If it's hard to take these villains seriously due to the overwhelming power dynamic, then maybe making these movies more about the character dynamics and goofiness of the situation is the way to go. I mean, even though Wonder Woman 1984 might have flopped completely, I think it's still easy to see that the writers of these movies were trying to take themselves a little less seriously. Hell, in my opinion, the best scene in the entire movie is the mall scene in the beginning because none of it is taken seriously. Wonder Woman showcases her incredible power and the whole scene is filled with comedy and wackiness. It's only when they turn serious that the whole movie really starts to fall apart and be less enjoyable. But sadly, in the end, I do believe that it's this incredible power dynamic that can make it a bit hard for people to enjoy DC movies. As I mentioned earlier on, the realistic to unrealistic balance between Marvel and DC movies is probably why most people tend to gravitate towards Marvel characters. The fact that Marvel movies feature more realistic and human characters means that a general audience will be able to relate to them more than overpowering beings like Superman. Hell, why do you think Batman is the most popular DC character today? I mean, out of everybody in the DC Comics lineup, he is still the only one that's a human being. Sure, he's rich, he's powerful, he's great at hand-to-hand combat, but at the end of the day, Batman is still just a man with human limits, a man that can die just like any of us. Just like everyone in the MCU lineup. But even though he's the most relatable character, I would argue that the other members of the DCEU can grow to become as beloved and as iconic as the more realistic heroes of the MCU on the big screen. To become another successful superhero-based cinematic universe, the DCEU should focus more on their wacky aspects and goofy ideas. Sure, some seriousness is required to make these movies feel like they have real stakes. You can't necessarily have every movie be entirely comedy-based. But when a world is full of gods among us normal humans, then maybe focusing on character growth and comedic moments will be the key to a fun experience. When a god is challenged by a mere mortal, then the conflict really isn't going to be coming from that mortal. After all, when we don't believe in the threat of this mortal enemy in the first place, then where exactly is the threat of the story supposed to be coming from? Instead, it should focus on the inner dialogue of the god himself or his relationship with other powerful super beings. But if it's taken way too seriously, like in the first few Thor movies, then it's going to end up just feeling boring or uninteresting because at the end of the day, these overly powerful beings shouldn't be treated so seriously. Hell, even the MCU took a while to figure this one out. Which is why, when they finally did figure this out, the MCU created one of their more captivating movies to date in Thor Ragnarok. The MCU lately has started to lean more into their wacky comic book origins, but the DCEU, with their back catalog of outlandish characters, actually has an opportunity to get a one-up on their competition. If they can embrace their goofiness and focus more on being a live-action cartoon rather than a realistic portrayal of their heroes, then maybe the DCEU can finally be a unique and compelling superhero-based cinematic universe. Thank you all so much for watching this video on the DCEU. Do you agree with me that it should become more of an over-the-top and goofy cinematic universe? Or am I going a bit too far in saying that turning down the seriousness of this cinematic universe can be a good thing overall? Let me know down in the comments section below, and as always, have a good day. Bye-bye.